Okay, this story is a kind of a puzzler, and it's a puzzle I've never completely solved. I heard it from a fine old man named George Head, who at that time was living in the town of Fort George, which was relocated later on to Chisasibi. And it left some questions very much unanswered in my mind. And I went back, well, George died a few years after, but I went back and told the story to John Blacknett to see if he could explain it to me. And he was interested, and he told me that I told the story very well, that he could almost visualize it. But the mystery has remained a mystery, and we'll have to wait till the end of the story to share that one. But I will share one thing. This is a story about two old men who are testing each other's conjuring powers, which was a hazard when conjuring was more common, because they were competitive. They wanted to have the most power. And one of these men had, for his power, a bag that hung under the rack where meat was kept up and away from the dogs during the winter, or dried meat further along than that. The other one's source of power was an ally, I guess we would call it, a skunk. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but that becomes very important because in the story, the man goes underground. Skunks are burrowing animals. And so that adds a little bit of meaning to it. Anyway, first the story and then a few comments. These old men were both powerful men, and their names in English were Wide Lake and Louse, as in the singular of lice. Well, the one old man wanted to test the power of the other old man, so he decided he wanted to make the other old man angry so that he would use his power and in this way make it exposed to a challenge, to a contest. So he decided that what he would do was he would go over to this other old man's camp and take with him a bunch of caribou hides that he had collected up. And so he went over and he said, I would really like to have a fish net for these caribou hides. And the other old man was quite respectful, welcoming. He said, sure. He says, I could use the hides, and I won't give you an old net, I'll give you a brand new net. And so the exchange was made, and they went their way. Then the next day, the man went back and he said, I want my hides back. I'm not satisfied with this fish net. And the man said, well, I was pleased with the hides, and maybe we can have some consideration. And the man said, no, I want my hides back. And he left the net and took his hides back. Now that was very disrespectful, very rude, on purpose. He wanted to make that man angry, and he succeeded. So the next day he thought, okay, I'm going to find out just how powerful he is. So he took his spear and went over to the other man's area and went near the rack where that bag was hanging, and he knew that the bag contained the power. He knew that the old man whose bag it was had a reputation for knowing when the bag had used its power on somebody because that person had come very close. And when that would happen, he would tell the women, go and see who's dead out there. So this man, as I say, took his spear, and when he got quite close to the bag, using the spear, he drew 2 lines in the sand. And then he came a little bit closer, and the power came out of the bag, and it came to the first line. It slowed, and then it came over the second line, like a wave. Like a wave it came, but it couldn't go past the second line. So that man went home, satisfied that he had tested the power and not been harmed. But he knew he was going to have to be careful because he'd angered that other man, and maybe the other man would take some initiative that he would have to counter. Nothing happened for quite some time. And one day he decided that he wanted to go out and check his nets, and so he took a paddle down, and he discovered that the other paddle was missing. He thought, well, maybe the kids have been playing with it and it's floated off. So he went out in the canoe to check the nets, and he saw the paddle in the water. Reached down and he picked it up. Looked fine. There was a little bit of seaweed on the blade of it. So he reached down and flicked the seaweed off. And the moment he did that, he could feel the power entering him. The other man's power was in the seaweed. It was a real surprise. So he hurried home. He could feel the power coming up his arm. So he put on a tourniquet, but it didn't seem to stop the power. He moved the tourniquet up on his arm. Finally, he moved up nearly to his shoulder where he wouldn't be able to relocate the tourniquet up further. He said to the other people in the camp, all that will save me now is a skunk. I have to have a skunk. So people hurried out looking to see if they could find a skunk. Everybody, even the dogs. And one of the dogs found a skunk, and he brought it back. And so they put a little of the skunk musk on his arm. And although he was delirious, he said, I can feel the musk of the skunk, the wee of the skunk, and I'm going to be all right. And sure enough, the swelling went down, and he had a vision of a giant skunk, giant in power, not size, going up his arm to the shoulder and then stopping the power that was attacking him. So after he had managed to stop the swelling, he decided that he was going to attack his enemy again. This time, he went underground, and he came up inside the other old man's teepee, and he climbed up a teepee pole to where there were horizontal poles. You'd hang something to dry on, or maybe hang a pot from it. And he went across on one of these horizontal poles until he was right over the hearth, and then he spit in the hearth, and a big cloud came up and filled the teepee. And he jumped down and he grabbed that old man by the throat And he took him out and he killed him right there. That was the end of that other old man. He had won. Sometime later, he was asked to stay behind when the others were going on a caribou hunt to hammer the long bones that they had already collected, to break them up so that they can be boiled and the marrow fat, the grease, can be rendered from them. And so that's what he did. And after he had done it for a while, 2 splinters came up from his hammering, and one stuck in one eye and the other in the other eye. He couldn't get them out, and he couldn't see. He was blind. So when the people came back, he told them what had happened, that he was blind, he couldn't see, and they needed to help him get these splinters out of his eye. They couldn't see any way they could do it. So finally they sent for an old woman some distance away who was a very capable curer. And she came and sized up the situation, and she said, "Grandson, I'm going to leave you now. I can't help you because the old man that you killed used to feed me and my family." And she left. And that left the winning conjurer out of luck. And so he told the other people in his group, "The only thing you can do for me now is make me a canoe and a paddle. And I'm going to paddle around, and then I'm going to hear a seal break water, and I'm going to shoot that seal with my bow and arrow. Then I'm going to go ashore and snare some rabbits, and I'm going to make a big feed from seal meat and the rabbit meat." And those were his last words, and he died. Whoops! What's going on? Well, when I told the story to John, he said sometimes when somebody is dying, he likes to think back on what it was he enjoyed the most in his life. So maybe that's what he's talking about when he asks for the canoe. Because after all, how can a blind man shoot a seal with a bow and arrow? And I have no other answer for it. I can see it as a kind of a vision or a dream experience or a hallucination or something like that from an old man who is blind and trapped by his own desire for power and the wrongdoing that he committed while doing it. So I think that's probably it. And I'll never know. George Head was a fine old man, one who told me the story. And while I was recording stories from him, he stood up at the end and shook my hand, and he said, "You can tell the people that hear these stories that you were told them by somebody that used to trap around Lake Kaniapaskau. That's way inland. Here's a man that, when he walked to work, went about 200 kilometers by snowshoe, pulling a toboggan. So a sturdy man. And a pleasing person for me to meet. But it's left me with questions, obviously. I thought when I first looked at the story, I thought, quote, ever metaphorical. Then I thought, oops, that's what I think. What would a Cree think was metaphorical? What can I be sure is metaphorical as a Cree is thinking about it? So I went through the story line by line, and I found one, only one. The power came like a wave. Like a wave is a metaphor. I asked Gertie, "Oh, I don't think Crees have metaphors," she said. "Well, how about shooting a seal with a bow and arrow, all blind? How about make me a canoe, when he wasn't going to be using a canoe?" These things aren't exactly metaphors, but they are certainly symbolic of something. And maybe it is a dying man's wish or reminiscence of what pleased him the most. Anyway, that's the story.